Hello, and welcome to this week's Rights in Russia interview. Today, it's our privilege to host Andreas Umland, a political scientist and expert in modern Russian and Ukrainian history and politics. He lives in Kiev and teaches at the National University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Dr. Umland is also a senior scholar at the Swedish Institute of International Relations in Stockholm. He's written extensively on the development of post-Soviet countries, including studies of the extreme right and nationalism. Thank you for joining us at this time of crisis in Ukraine, Andreas.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
Could you tell us about the current situation in the conflict? Where is the front line, if in fact there is one?
Well, there are several front lines in the north, in the east, and in the south. As it looks now, the worst situation is in the south. The city of Kherson has been apparently captured, which seems to be the largest city that Russian forces have been able to capture so far. There's apparently especially heavy fighting going on in eastern Ukraine around Kharkiv, in the Donbass. So, and there's also fighting around Kiev. I've just called friends in Kiev, and they told me that they now they now hear constantly, shelling, and they already got used to the sound of the shelling. Although the city itself seems to have been hit so far only by a few rockets or missiles. So it's a very worrying situation, and and there are actually, for me, the most bizarre story in all of this is that we have now, for instance, heavy fighting and apparently also killing of civilians at Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, which has 6 active reactors. And that seems to be largely to escape Western attention. The risks that are affiliated with that. There is another nuclear power plant in Mykolaiv, in the vicinity of this nuclear power plant. There's also heavy fighting. So this is a new situation. I mean, it's not only very regrettable for Ukraine and the Ukrainians, but it's also creating risks that we haven't seen in Europe since, I would say, 1945. This goes also way beyond the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. This conflict has a dimension that I think, my impression is, many in the West have not yet fully grasped the various repercussions of it, the risks, the threats that come with it.
So is it too early to say that Putin's invasion was just a huge miscalculation, given the very strong resistance of the Ukrainian forces?
Yes, in terms of the resistance, I think it was miscalculated. Apparently, there was the idea that Russian paratroopers or special units and so-called diversante, the apparently sleeper agents that were already located in Kiev, would quickly take over the city, catch Zelensky, install a puppet government. This has not worked out. That is also, by the way, one of the reasons that, while I was very unhappy that I was accidentally not in Kiev when the war broke out. I have my elderly parents here in Germany, and I visit them once per month, and I was on my regular visit to them when the war broke out. But apparently there was a deep infiltration of Kiev with these sort of sleeper agents who were waiting for a call to become active. And the first few days, the major threat for Ukraine was perhaps not the troops actually, but these so-called diversante in Kiev. And the major task then also for the Ukrainian armed forces was to catch them and to neutralize them. And that's perhaps was good that I wasn't there, because I could have become, if I would be, sort of transmitting news directly from Kiev and would be clear that I'm in Kiev, I would have brought danger to my friends and neighbors and so on. So in that way, I was in a certain way also then happy not to be there, because I would have brought, I could have become a target of this so-called diversante. But that seems to be now a problem largely solved, as far as I gathered from the information that I get. And now it's actually the main danger is just an ordinary, if you want to call it like that, occupation of Kiev, which I think is going to be very difficult. It seems that the Russian leadership is now learning that this is going to be difficult. That almost impossible, because basically, most of the population is still there. Actually, we have now 1 million refugees, but Ukraine has 40 million citizens. So most of the people are still there, and apparently most of the population of Kiev, which has about 3 million people, they are ready to resist in one way or another. Not all of them are under weapons, but apparently there has been now a large amount of weapons simply distributed to everybody who wanted a gun. And so I think that's going to be difficult to capture Kiev. And then what I fear is a sort of a terroristic bombing campaign that will, what we've seen already in Syria, as what Russian planes and missiles have already done in Syria, basically bombing Ukraine into a capitulation. That is my greatest fear so far. And as I mentioned already, these fights close to the nuclear power stations.
Mm-hmm. And do we know anything more about Russia's plans for the coming days and the months? I mean, does anybody have access to their plans?
I haven't seen yet. Obviously, if you look at the movements of the troops, the obvious target is Kiev, and and there's also, I think, this sort of Russian understanding of a power vertical. That you could basically imagine that if you would have a sort of coup or some sort of takeover in Moscow. Somebody would take over the Kremlin, the TV stations, and so on, and would then say, now I'm the new ruler. And then perhaps in Russia, many people would actually then simply succumb to this, and then that we would then have a new ruler, and would then sort of build up from above a power vertical. But that's not possible in Ukraine. Even if Russian troops enter Kiev, they capture the main buildings, they install a puppet government. What doesn't mean anything. People will just not follow orders, and it would be immediately become a national sport of who kills first the puppet governor, so to say. And it may be difficult actually to find somebody for this role, because I guess this person will know that he or she would be under enormous risk. So this is not how Ukrainian politics works. So the Ukrainians have kicked out their first president, Leonid Kravchuk, in 1994, who was then standing again for re-election, and they, exchanged him for Kuchma, which was not maybe the ideal choice, but Ukrainian politics does not work as Russian politics, and so even if the troops capture Kiev, which I think, as I said, would be very difficult, it's not clear what that then would actually mean. Whether there will be actually any sustainable victory that Russia could count as a real victory. So I don't know what the plan is. I think the very that's from the beginning. That's also why I always thought this scenario that we are now observing to be the less likely scenario. I've published about this over the last year. I had in summer an article in the National Interest where I spoke about this. We had with a colleague from my Stockholm Center for East European Studies, John Zachau, we had a little brief policy brief called Putin, Smith and Wesson, which was about the scenarios, the different military scenarios where we had this major escalation scenario that is currently happening. But I always thought of this particular scenario that we are now observing as being less likely, because it's unclear to me what is actually the end game. You know, where does Putin at the end want to come out with this? Because capturing Kiev will not actually change that much. Ukraine will not become a vassal state of Russia, or even if the whole country is captured, which is actually not possible because it's just too large. And even as big a country as Russia would not have the necessary manpower and financial resources to actually sustain an occupation of as large a country as Ukraine. So that's why I was also surprised when I realized that the plan is not just to capture, let's say, the North Crimea Canal, which was the canal for the fresh water that was supplied to Crimea until 2014 from the Dnieper River. So they now captured this canal. That was something I could imagine happening. But this march on Kiev is a true surprise also for me, and I don't know actually what the Russian plan is. I think now the plan is basically to get some sort of deal with the Ukrainians. That's why we have now the negotiations, and then to get concessions from the West and from Ukraine. But that is now actually becoming more and more difficult, because for Zelensky or for any other Ukrainian president, it will, with every additional day of war, it will be more difficult to make any concessions, because the proportion of the population that will not want to give anything away, anything to the Russians, is growing actually. And so I don't know what that will, how this can all end. So and now people actually, I just saw a post on Facebook. People are saying we should get all this done by May, and get by May Crimea back, so before the season, the holiday season starts. So that's the mood that you have now here.
Yeah. And what about the West? What is the West doing, and should it be doing more? Can it do more?
Well, partly Putin has calculated well this, because the major business operations between the West and Russia are still in place. These are the energy exports, gas, oil, and I don't know to which degree coal is still and other raw materials are being still exported. The millions of euros that are still paid for that. So this is still working. In that way, Putin calculated well, and I think one should tell especially continental Europeans, West Europeans, that the best thing that they can do to resist this and to end this whole carnage in Ukraine, and also to do something for their own security, because as I mentioned, there are these battles around nuclear power plants, is to check where the gas comes from that they are using, or where the electricity comes from that they are using, or where the heating comes from that they are using. That is much better than going with a Ukrainian flag to a demonstration. So once this stops, I think then we'll get to the end of the game. But so far, the sanctions are, of course, much larger than anything we've ever seen. In terms of financial sanctions, the technology sanctions, but so far the major business operations and the major income for Russia is still there, and it's paid by the West or by the European Union. And that's both. One has to distinguish here a little bit between oil and gas, because gas does not play a big part in the Russian state budget. So the budgetary income from the gas exports is not large, but Gazprom is subsidizing the entire Russian economy and most Russian households with cheap gas, and this subsidy to the Russian economy and to Russian private households is only possible as long as there is this income from the gas exports. So the gas exports are also very important for Russia, although they do not appear directly in the Russian state budget. But the oil, for instance, is a major position in the state budget, and it's still flowing, as far as I understand.
There's been talk of a no-fly zone that the Western powers would institute to protect civilians. Is that realistic?
I'm afraid it's not, at least not in the way that Ukrainians want that. They basically want, this to be enforced by NATO planes, which is not going to happen. Apparently, there are some other options to at least, get or to decrease the hegemony of Russia in the air. The most obvious option is delivering weapons, especially anti-aircraft weapons, but perhaps now also fighter planes. Apparently, there may be also options to use electronic means, electromagnetic means to enforce maybe a fly zone. I've just picked it up somewhere, and I can't really assess how realistic that is to use electronic means to enforce such a no-fly zone. And then what has recently been discussed is that there is now already readiness to deliver not only defensive but also offensive weapons to Ukraine, including fighter planes. And so far, there has been talk mainly about Soviet-era fighter planes because that's what Ukrainian pilots could be flying. And there was, for a brief moment, I don't know how serious that was, a discussion about perhaps having Polish, for instance, airports where Ukrainian pilots with Ukrainian planes could be flying combat missions over Ukrainian state territory. And as far as I understood, that's for now off the table. I hope it may come back to the table because, as I said, the risks here are concerning directly national interests of Western states with these, for instance, with fights around nuclear power plants, but also we have now 1 million refugees, and the help for these 1 million refugees is really encouraging. All of Europe is basically engaged in helping these refugees. But what happens once we get the 11th million, the 12th million, the 13th million, the 14th million refugees? What's going to happen then? How much enthusiasm will there then be for Ukrainian refugees? So, and there are lots of Ukrainians, and especially if Putin goes totally nuts and starts a terror war here, then we may soon get, once electricity, water supply, heating, foodstuff, then people will flee by the millions and not by the hundreds of thousands as currently. And then maybe we will actually get to a different. Then people will start thinking perhaps about actually enforcing a no-fly zone. But currently the idea is still, we have this good planet, which is NATO and the EU, and then there's the other planet. It's the Eastern planet, and we shouldn't get on this bad planet. And and once people realizing that we are not on different planets, we are on one continent, and there's no physical border between Eastern and Western Europe, then I think we may return to this idea of a no-fly zone.
And what do you make of Putin's reference to nuclear weapons?
I think that's a smart play with with fear. I think it should not be taken seriously because from all what we know, the Russian leadership is very well aware of the difference between a conflict with a non-NATO country and a conflict with NATO. So, for instance, the most Russian city outside Russia is not, as many people think, in Ukraine, and is not Sevastopol, as many people think. The most Russian city outside Russia is Narva in eastern Ukraine, on the Russian-Estonian border, which has a higher percentage, over 95% of Russian speakers than Sevastopol, higher percentage of ethnic Russians. And there has, and also in Estonia, the human rights of Russians are much less enforced than in Ukraine. Because, for instance, you have in Estonia if you've moved, I think after the year 1940 to Estonia, you have to pass an examination to get Estonian citizenship. There's never anything like that in Ukraine. So there would be actually a much stronger argument to attack Estonia and to take back Narva, heavily the most Russian city outside Russia, and Russia has never even tried that. Why? Because Estonia is a NATO member and a EU member. So we can, from that we can conclude that there is a very big, and why is Russia not doing it? Is because here suddenly you're playing with your own future, with your own fate, if you want. Now you're playing just with Ukraine's fate, or with the Moldovan's fate, with the Georgian. You can either extinguish them or not extinguish them, and then Russia will still exist. There's no existential issue here for Russia involved. But just getting back the city of Narva, where, as I said, there would be better arguments to actually take back Narva, because Estonia has still not given citizenship, ordinary citizenship, to a large part of its population. Those Russian speakers who have refused or have not been ready to pass this examination, and Russia has never even tried that, because there's a big difference between invading Ukraine and invading a NATO member country. What I'm now that if we speak about nuclear weapons, I think a much more likely scenario at a certain point could be the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine or in another non-NATO country. That is, I think, something that we may observe in a worst case scenario at a certain point. It could be something like, as the US did with Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, that Russia would simply bomb, exterminate a Ukrainian city, let's say in Western Ukraine, where there are no or fewer Russians or Russian speakers, and then would say, here you got this now, and please capitulate now. And then probably Ukraine would capitulate, actually, if a nuclear weapon would be used. So that is a real risk. I think it's a small risk so far. I would hope that this is still far from being on the minds of Russian generals, but I would not exclude that. But the nuclear threat towards NATO is, I think, a pure play with psychology, and it's working very well. I'm here in Germany, in the city of Jena. There was today in the local newspaper a picture of a bunker in Jena that is being prepared. That's where we are here now, and people are reading that, are really scared now, and to get them scared this way is exactly the purpose of all of that. And it's basically, the calculation here is that Putin exerts pressure on the West, then the West exerts pressure on Ukraine, and Ukraine will then be pressured to make concessions. And I think that's the hope that behind these threats.
So looking back, why has it come to this, and why has Putin invested so much, his political future maybe, as well as massive economic and human resources? Why is he invested in this destructive military adventure?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can fully rationally explain it, because now this Vabank playing game that he's now playing doesn't really make sense from his point of view, from the Kremlin's point of view, because the stakes are simply, I mean, they could have just gone on with the Minsk agreements. They could have, I mean, the status quo before that wasn't that bad for Russia. Yeah. So, and they had certain instruments, particularly the Minsk agreements were given, that they could endlessly exploit to exert pressure on Ukraine. I suspect there may be actually domestic processes here that may be driving this, and there might be psychological processes. I think there was always, or there may have been also the calculation that once you increase the stakes, then the West and Ukraine will back down, and you will get some concessions. And so, but but then you increase the stakes, you don't get anything. But then within the sort of logic of the sort of street crime logic of Russian politics, where you have to protect your respect, you then can actually not you cannot go down again you cannot simply withdraw and say, now we've tried that, now it's over, because then you suddenly appear as weak. So there was this constant escalation. I don't think they really wanted to go into this. That was perhaps their something that they were not actually planning for. They thought that we put in more troops, and we then recognize the republics, and then we escalate further and further and further. And at a certain point, somebody will say, let's stop and let's give the Russians whatever they want, just to have no war. And then apparently they got to a stage when they thought, now we have to actually do what we've announced that we would be doing. And that may be then something that has a lot to do with domestic affairs, that Putin cannot appear as being weak.
Mm-hmm. And so when you look at videos of Putin talking with his ministers kind of across an empty hall or sitting at one of those long tables, you get the impression of an isolated leader. Is that the case?
Yeah, I guess that's a large part of the story. The problem with all of these calculations about Putin's psychology and the inner workings of the Kremlin and so on is that the guys we are talking about are KGB guys, and they know very well how to be secretive and how to manipulate information, how to make things appear differently than they are. So we don't really know what's going on. There's been for years now the speculation that Putin may be ill and terminally ill, and maybe that is sort of driving his behavior, but we don't know that for sure. So, and there's been all this talk about the different clans or the different towers in the Kremlin, and the different patronal networks there. But how far this really plays a role in all of that, how far rational considerations play a role, it's difficult to say. Probably a large role in all of this played Russian propaganda and the fact that the Russian leadership was sort of believing its own propaganda. I've observed that myself in East Germany, in the last years of East Germany, when basically just before the whole thing broke down, the leadership did not seem to have any idea, how bad things are, because they were sort of watching their own television and thought, this is not that there was no urge actually to do something. And here also they may have gotten basically a picture of Ukraine and also of the West that was a sort of that was basically provided by sycophants who would always tell basically the leader what he wants to hear. The bad stories about Ukraine, that Ukraine is just a joke, that the president is a comedian, that there's no country, really no nation, that there is that Russian soldiers would be greeted with flowers and so on. And that's probably what Putin wanted to hear. And so he got that from his underlings, and then he started believing it. And now he may be wondering what's actually happening.
So some oligarchs have criticized the war, and there have been demonstrations against the war in Russia. But how important is opinion outside the Kremlin? And is there a chance that Putin might be overthrown?
Well, again, that's part of the problem that I mentioned before, that the Kremlin is very secretive, and we don't know whether there are any significant divisions, whether there is some sort of opposition faction, or now I've read a Russian oligarch or a Russian entrepreneur has put out a bounty on Putin of $1 million, I think. So it's difficult to say. I think for the demonstrations, I mean, we can say for sure that they will only have an impact if they become really large. So far, they are just too small, and they can be, if they become too large for the police to handle, that would mean like hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Then this may become a factor. But now, currently, with these small, and on these oligarchs, I don't think that Putin really cares. He may not even care enough to put them in prison for what they say. They just let them say whatever they want to say. Their reputation in Russia is not very high anyway. So that doesn't seem to play much of a role.
So to what extent does Putin represent elite groups outside the Kremlin?
Well, I guess there is a part of society that is actually firmly on his side. After decades of indoctrination, you have probably, and the opinion polls have been actually so far indicating that about half of the population of Russia actually supports that, on the premise that this is indeed just a demilitarization operation, as it's portrayed in Russia, and that it doesn't cost much. I think with every additional day, I think this support is probably declining that the operation had at the beginning, and I mean that basically is a sort of a repetition of what we've already observed in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. That it's nice to have Crimea, and especially nice to have Crimea if it doesn't cost anything. So that's why the annexation of Crimea was, I think, part of the popularity of the annexation was its seeming peacefulness, that no war, and that I think was also a major miscalculation of the West back then, in that the West pressured the new Ukrainian government after the Euromaidan to not call the troops that were there actually on Ukraine, on Crimea. There were what I've read about 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers who never got an order to actually resist the annexation. If they had gotten an order, probably many of them would have not followed the order. They would have deserted or would have run over to the Russian side. But I suspect a few thousand would have actually followed the order and would have done what their profession is, to protect the fatherland. And then we would have had a war in Crimea that probably Ukraine would have lost anyway. But then I think the annexation would not have been as popular in Russia. It would have changed basically the whole course of the conflict, and maybe we could have then avoided the war in eastern Ukraine, because then the whole situation would have been very different. And I think the Crimea experience was also something that Putin was thinking he could basically repeat in Kiev. You quickly move in, you take over the major buildings, and then it's a quick operation, no major casualties, not many bad pictures, and sort of so this was one of many mistakes back in the last 20 years that have been made by the West to seek for peace at any price, and then encouraging basically ever more escalation.
So finally, and this is my last question, what do you think will happen in the short term and then in the longer term? What's your prediction?
I mean, that's now very difficult to do, actually, because the situation is changing by the day. I mean, what I hope will happen soon is that these energy imports from Russia will stop, because I think it's almost something pathological. I mean, Russia conducts a war in the vicinity of nuclear power plants, and we are co-financing this war. I mean, where's our national interest here? We should be, we may be sort of not, we may not care much about the lives of Ukrainians, but we should be caring about our own lives, and our own health, and of our children and our grandchildren. So, and we still have the major leverage that we do have is still there and unused, which are these energy exports. That would mean that energy prices raise further in the in the European Union, but that's how these things work. So if that happens, I think we can perhaps get to an end very quickly.
Well, these are certainly dark days, and I want to thank you so much, Andreas Umland, for appearing on Rights in Russia and sharing your insights. We hope to see you back again in better times.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me.